Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorites, that is Revelation Space by Alastair Reynolds. Stay tuned. Alright, Jordan here. So just a little bit of context. Revelation Space is by the British author Alastair Reynolds, who was an actual working astrophysicist when he published this book. This is actually the author's debut novel, which is kind of astonishing. Reynolds wrote this book when he was working at the European Space Agency in the Space Research and Technology Center. So that's pretty cool, and it's something you can absolutely sense when you're reading his books. You feel like scientifically that you're in good hands. Like everything is just so well realized and scientifically accurate. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So this is book one in the Revelation Space series. I've read a decent amount of this series, so I would recommend starting with this book and reading through the main trilogy before going on to the other books. So when you finish this, read Redemption Arc. Okay, that's the second book. Then Absolution Gap, and that's the original trilogy. And then I'd move on to the inhibitor phase if you're a completionist, because that will complete what Reynolds calls the inhibitor sequence. And then I would go to Chasm City, which is a standalone, but it takes place near the time of the first books. And then as for the rest, I wouldn't really be able to tell you for sure because I haven't read those. So after that, I would just say, based on what I've been told, you should read Diamond Dogs, Turquoise Days, which is 2 novellas, Galactic North, which is a collection of short stories, the short story Monkey Suit. Then I'd read The Prefect, which is book 1 of the Prefect Dreyfus emergencies. These are like neo-noir police procedurals or detective novels set in the Revelation Space universe, followed by Elysium Fire. And then I guess in 2024, Reynolds is doing a third Prefect Dreyfus book called Machine Vendetta. I know that's a lot there, and it can be a little overwhelming, but the fact that he has so many books set in the Revelation Space universe is probably a good thing for us. Let us start with a little bit of a synopsis for Revelation Space. Revelation Space takes place in the 26th century, at a point when humans have achieved easy space travel and can journey vast distances in light hugger ships that fly close to the speed of light. The story is told from 3 different character POVs that gradually converge. The story opens in the year 2551 as our first character, Dan Sylvestre, a xenoarchaeologist and wealthy scion of a prominent scientific family, is overseeing a dig on the far-flung planet of Resurgam, where nearly 1 million years ago an enigmatic bird-like race known as the Amarantin were suddenly and inexplicably wiped out by what seems to have been their own sun. His theory is that maybe this ancient race was more intelligent and technologically sophisticated than anyone had ever imagined. During the excavation, Sylvestre uncovers a long-buried obelisk that holds all sorts of clues about this extinct race, and it looks like Sylvestre's theories are right. But there's a political coup, and Sylvestre's world is rocked like never before as he is first held in captivity, then later adventures to far-flung worlds in search of answers to the mystery that has captivated his scientific imagination for so long. Sylvestre's driving question is this: why did this ancient alien race, the Amarantin, die out all of a sudden, especially when they were at the height of their technological and civilizational powers? Was it natural? Were they annihilated? Sylvestre will go to any lengths to find answers before history repeats itself. Next we have Ilya Volyova, member of a small crew of Ultras. Ultras, for lack of a better description, are essentially scary gothic cyberpunk transhuman people who've augmented themselves with implants and blood machines and prostheses and biomechatronic parts to deal with the rigors of intersolar travel over vast distances and timescales. These Ultras are looking for another crew member after one of their own goes mad and dies due to circumstances that I won't spoil. They interview candidates on the planet Yellowstone in a cyberpunk city called Chasm City, which has been overrun by a crazy bio-nanovirus called the Melding Plague. There, the Ultras find a replacement named NIKKI, but that's just a pit stop. Their real mission is to track down Dan Sylvestre. They need him because only he, with the help of his father's beta simulation, can save their comatose captain who's been infected by the Melding Plague. And so this plague is intermingling his flesh, and the virus is infecting the ship. The ship's name, by the way, is the Nostalgia for Infinity. Lastly, we have our third character, NIKKI, an ex-soldier who was accidentally transported to the planet Yellowstone while she was in reefer sleep. Kuri is brought on board the Nostalgia for Infinity to replace their dead gunnery officer, but what the Ultras don't know is that Kuri is a paid assassin who's been contracted by a mysterious woman known only as the Mademoiselle to make her way to the planet of Resurgam to find Dan Sylvestre and immediately execute him. But Kuri has a dark past of her own, which may get in the way of her plans. All of this intrigue and building mystery takes place amidst the backdrop of artificial intelligence, exotic alien life forms, powerful world-destroying weapons, world-sized spaceships, cyberpunk cities, hive minds, matrix simulations, mind-bending physics, gigantic eldritch space objects, ancient space wars, and an unfathomably scary post-intelligent alien race known as the Inhibitors. Alright, so just a little synopsis there. Let's get into whether or not this book is going to be for you, because I know this author and this series has a reputation for being difficult. You often hear that Reynolds' writing is dense and overly technical. A lot of people really harp on how much description and exposition there is. So I would say this. Don't read this series if you're not interested in what they call hard science fiction, as opposed to, say, soft science fiction. And this is something I teach about in my fantasy and sci-fi class. This is science fiction that tries as hard as it can to be accurate in terms of how science is used and the extrapolations that the story makes. And so in hard science fiction, whether it's Arthur C. Clarke or Kim Stanley Robinson or Peter F. Hamilton or Greg Egan or Ann Leckie or Ian Banks, what you usually see is an attempt to take the most advanced information that we have on physics, evolutionary biology, astronomy, materials science, quantum mechanics, linguistics, whatever it is, and then extrapolate those out into the future. So it's this question of how can we project out into the future and predict what star drives will look like in 400 years? How many planets will we have colonized? How will we have augmented ourselves? What will artificial intelligence be able to do for us? What's realistic? So it's less focused on character and subjectivity, inner space, and more focused on the scientific and technological development, large-scale civilizations, warfare, weaponry, battle tactics, societal planning, colonization, exploration, terraforming of new worlds. So it's focused on outer space rather than inner space. So if that sounds interesting to you, this might be a series for you, but again, I'm going to apply one of John Updike's major rules of literary criticism, and that is to try to understand what the author wished to do and do not blame him for not achieving what he did not attempt. So if you're picking up Revelation Space and you're expecting it to be Ray Bradbury or Mary Shelley or Frank Herbert or Ursula Le Guin, it's not going to be like that. This is an entirely different type of work of art. As one Goodreads reviewer said, there are more profound, awe-inspiring science fiction ideas in the first 200 pages of this book than there are in most sci-fi series. In terms of how dense it is, it depends on what dense means. Yes, I would describe Reynolds' writing as dense, for sure. But it's not dense like Gene Wolfe, where there are literally 10 different things that every sentence could mean, and there are secrets buried on every page of the first book that will only really make sense 3 books from now, right? So Reynolds is not making up words. He's not making veiled references to Ben Jonson and Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. So what I'm saying is Reynolds is dense in the sense that he throws you into the book in medias res, and you kind of have to piece together what's going on and where you are and how things work in the world. And I find that very satisfying. It's like a puzzle. It's also dense in the sense that when Reynolds introduces you to the starships in his science fictional universe, it's not Star Wars. He doesn't just say, here's the vessel, the crew is on the bridge, the ship is entering warp speed. No, he is going to introduce you to a woman, Ilya Volyova, who is the only person on the ship who is awake because everyone else is in reefer sleep. Everyone else is cryogenically preserved or whatever because of the vast amount of time it takes to get places. And when you meet Ilya Volyova, she's on her way up this vast elevator. Well, up is probably not actually accurate. She's in the ship elevator, and she's controlling the elevator with essentially her smartwatch. And Reynolds is showing you every level of the ship, from the crew levels to the utility sections to the cryogenic storage to the gunnery and rotating habitats and cage chambers and rad zones, to levels that are entirely forests with their own ecosystems, to the bridge and the spider room. The spider room, by the way, is this secret luxury room that has legs and can crawl smoothly over the exterior of the ship. So cool. So anyways, Reynolds is going to take you on a tour of the ship. He's going to show you how it works and give you a history of the conjoiners, right? The conjoiners are this highly evolved hive mind faction of human beings who invented the drives and who are the only ones who have the know-how and the wherewithal to create these drives and who have since stopped making them. So there's a scarcity of light hugger ships, which is really interesting. So it's very difficult to get one of these light hugger ships are ships that travel very close to the speed of light. Anyways, my point is that Reynolds is going to explain everything. And so that does require more exposition than you're going to get in most novels. So I'll say one last thing about this. While this series is dense, it's not like Steven Erikson dense in the sense that you don't know what's going on and you just have to trust that the author knows where he's going. That's never the case in this. If you just slow down, take your time, make sure you know what's going on when you're reading. Before you turn to the next page, just make sure you're understanding what's going on. You'll be totally fine and you really won't ever be confused. So yes, it's dense, but is it difficult? No, I wouldn't say it's difficult. And one of my favorite things about reading Alastair Reynolds is that you always feel like you're in good hands. Okay, let's get into a few more things I really like and think are worth mentioning here, and then we'll talk about the big idea. What else did I like? There are a bunch of mysteries at the heart of this story. And as I said, the first mystery is, what happened to this ancient alien race, the Amarantan? What wiped them out? Did it have to do with their level of technological sophistication? What happened to the banished ones? What is this neutron star, Cerberus? And what does it have to do with the Amarantan's annihilation? Who are the Shrouders and what are they up to? And are there really treasures inside the shrouds? And if not, what are they for? There are other questions. Who is the Mademoiselle? Who is Sun Eater? What are they up to? What really happened during the Dawn War? And I would say lastly, WTF is up with the ending, which is really good, but is also definitely an epic brain teaser. So those, I would say, are some of the big questions. And when you're done reading this, and if you find yourself wanting to dive deeper into some of these questions and you're a little bit confused, there's a channel called Quinn's Ideas. And this guy goes really into depth about a lot of these mysteries that I'm not going to get into because of spoilers, but I'll just briefly mention a few of the big sci-fi ideas in this book that I liked the most. There is Chasm City on Yellowstone, which is this domed cyberpunk city, and it's like the most advanced city in the galaxy. And because they use nanotechnology, the buildings can literally rearrange themselves and build themselves and add floors and stuff like that. But the city is mutated and covered in growths because of the melding plague. And so this is a disease that attacks machinery and biology. It's called the melding plague because the disease melds biological components to mechanical components and creates these horrifying cancerous growths that are all interconnected. And so this is what Captain Brannigan has, captain of the Nostalgia for Infinity. So he's basically hibernating. They're keeping him asleep, but they keep waking him up and activating him. But his body's so messed up and he's like rooted to the floor and connected to the ship, and he has to speak through these computer components because his body can't do it anymore. So that's really cool. Speaking of the Ultras who fly around in these giant light hugger ships, that's another really fascinating aspect of this book. So there's been a transhuman enlightenment, and so many of the characters, and especially the ones who live aboard these ships, are like super augmented cyberpunk freaks. And you get to be inside of some of their heads, especially in book 2. And Reynolds is such a genius in his ability to make them feel real and human, but also just the right amount of inhuman. There are different factions and different types of these transhumans. So I'll start with the Ultras. There are the Ultras. Many of them are either pale or black-skinned. They actually can change their skin color if they wish to. And they dress in black leather. They wear tattoos and glinting jewelry. And they slash their clothes to expose their prosthetic parts. Another neat touch is that even though they look super futuristic, they're actually perpetually out of touch from basically not being in contact with these different cultures, because they travel to and from these different planets, and they're basically out for so many years that they've lost touch. They use old-fashioned expressions and stuff like that. So, and then there are the Skyjacks, on the other hand, who don't crew interstellar ships. So they're like hipsters. And by the way, the Ultras have dreadlocks, which symbolize the number of reefer sleep stints that they've each done, right? So basically every dreadlock signifies how many times they've essentially kissed the speed of light. I'll read you a description of a couple of them. Sujik's arms vanished below her elbows into elaborately engraved bronze gauntlets, inlaid with ormolu-work windows which revealed constantly shifting holographics, diamond nails projecting from the 2 slender fingers of her mock hands. Most of Chiaraval's body was organic, but her eyes were feline cross-hatched red ellipses. Her flat nose exhibited no nostrils, merely sleekly rilled apertures, as if she was partially adapted to aquatic living. She wore no clothes, but apart from eyes, nostrils, mouth, and ears, her skin was seamless, like an all-enveloping sheath of ebony neoprene. Her breasts lacked nipples. Her fingers were dainty but without nails, and her toes were little more than vague suggestions, as if she'd been rendered by a sculptor anxious to begin another commission. As Volyova sat down, Chiaraval observed her with an indifference that was a little too studied to be genuine. And so those are the Ultras, the Chimerics. There are Ice Combers. These are like Skyjacks, but they're psycho-modified for extreme solitude because they work the Kuiper Belt zones and they're often alone. So they have to be kind of psychologically augmented to withstand that. There are Gillies, and these are aquatically modified humans that breathe liquid air, and for a variety of reasons, they actually serve as the system's police force. Some of them are so incapable of respiration and locomotion that they have to move around in these huge robotic fish tanks as they police the system. As I said before, there are the Conjoiners. These are descendants of an experimental group on Mars that has branched off. They have systematically upgraded their minds and swapped their brain cells out for machines until they're able to escalate to a new mode of consciousness that allows them to do really cool things and invent really brilliant things. The Conjoiners have these huge bioengineered veined cranial crests that dissipate excess heat because of how hard the machines are working in their heads. So you've got these fascinating human and transhuman different factions, but the alien life forms in this book are even cooler. I won't say much about the Shrouders because, like with a lot of things Reynolds does, when you start this book, you're going to think the Shrouders are one thing, and then when you get far enough in, you're going to realize the Shrouders are something totally different than you could have possibly imagined. Let's just say the Shrouders live in these shrouds, these bubbles of warped space-time. And we'll leave it at that. I don't want to say anything else. On an unrelated note, there's also, and I'm going to give the tiniest spoiler alert here, though, really this will hardly give anything away. So there's one of the coolest, we're going to call it a space object, one of the coolest space objects in this book. It's a giant planet-sized computer made out of nuclear matter. So it's basically the mass of a star devoted to processing information. And more spoilers, we actually get to explore it in this book. So Stephen Baxter calls this space object the most stunning and original alien artifact in modern science fiction. So it's just stuff like that that makes Alastair Reynolds so special. Definitely reminds you of the Arthur C. Clarke or Isaac Asimov quote, I forget who it was, who said any science sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. You really get the sense that even though there are some really, really profound mind-bending ideas in Alastair Reynolds, he always makes them feel plausible. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention my favorite aliens in this book, the pattern jugglers. So the pattern jugglers reminded me so much, for some reason, of Lem's Solaris. That may be where Reynolds got the idea. So the jugglers are ancient. They're on many worlds. We're told the Shrouders encountered them first, and they're essentially conscious, planet-sized oceans that basically work like a vast biological archiving system. So the jugglers can store human personalities in their oceanic matrix, so that anyone who swims in the juggler sea and is dissolved and reconstituted in the process achieves a kind of immortality. So the jugglers remember anyone who visits them, down to the very last cell, down to the most basic synaptic connection. And then later, those patterns that they record can be realized again and temporarily imprinted into the mind of other people. So the interesting thing is that because the process is so muddy and biological and a tiny bit precise, the stored patterns are subtly contaminated by millions of other impressions. And so nothing is completely clean, and the consciousnesses are subtly influencing one another in this vast oceanic matrix, and this ends up actually being a really important facet of the story. Anyways, the final thing I want to mention in this What I Like segment is less a concrete idea and more the way in which Reynolds has accomplished something momentous in his own genre, which is to create his own unique aesthetic. I'd call this subgenre that Reynolds has been innovating in neo-noir cyber-gothic space opera, which is on the back and front of the book. Gonzo cyber-goth space opera, intensely compelling, darkly intelligent, hugely ambitious. That's what Paul Macaulay says. So yeah, I'm going to return to one of my favorite Harold Bloom quotes here. This is the late, great literary critic Harold Bloom, who believed that what makes a book fundamentally great is its, quote, idiosyncratic strangeness. He defined this as a mode of originality that either cannot be assimilated or that so assimilates us that we cease to see it as strange. And that's what Reynolds does. Reynolds is an interesting writer in the sense that he breaks a lot of the norms. He violates a lot of the strictures of the genre he's operating in. I said it's neo-noir, cyber-gothic space opera. What makes it neo-noir? There's a world weariness and a cynicism that exists in a really unique tension, I would say, with the techno-optimism. There's a sense of dark mystery, and many of the characters, especially the Ultras, have a very distrustful, Machiavellian, almost sociopathic orientation toward others and the world. And I happen to know that many of Reynolds' other works, including Chasm City and the Prefect Dreyfus books, are like police procedural and detective novels. So Reynolds has this very noir sensibility that he infuses with space opera and with the hard sci-fi that he does. And I found that to be very original. But he's also playing with gothic and horror themes and tropes as well. And he's doing it in a way that is totally novel, right? For example, there is the fact that Reynolds actually finds a scientifically plausible way in this book to make it so that there are ghosts that haunt one of the main characters. And the best place to encounter these ghosts is in the quote-unquote spider room, right? So there are these gothic elements. You have mysterious characters like the Mademoiselle, who is this like AI Miss Havisham implanted in this other character's brain, who this character can speak to while she's inside of her head throughout the novel. There's this very sort of Estella, Miss Havisham sort of lingering tension and influence over Anna Khoury by the Mademoiselle. And there's the Mademoiselle's, her dogs, her quote-unquote dogs. There are janitor rats who are connected with the ship's main computer and who communicate in this very creepy way with the crew. So everything's got this gothic feel to it. Oftentimes space opera can feel cold, antiseptic, shiny. There's swoopy, futuristic spaceships and utopian, gleaming cities, which is very different from the sort of witchy, cobwebby, overgrown, haunted feel that you get when you're reading gothic literature. And yet somehow Reynolds is able to fuse these two together. There's the drone wolfhounds in this, right? They're called wolfhounds, but they're drones. There is, of course, the glittering mucoid plague-infected ship captain whose body has broken out of its casket and is growing tumorous appendages and roots. So again, there's this very Lovecraftian, Edgar Allan Poe sort of sensibility and noir sensibility mixed in with the kind of cold cyberpunk element. I'll even give you a description of Ilya Volyova, who, as I said, is one of the main characters, and you can really see what I mean just in the character descriptions. The woman's face was unremarkable, almost monochromatically pale of complexion, short dark hair, and a facial structure somewhere between elfin and skeletal, framing deep-set, narrow, slanted eyes that dispensed little compassion. She had hardly changed at all, but that was the point of Ultras. Again, this very gothic, pale with dark hair, skeletal and elfin somehow fused. All right, that is good for now on that. Let's move into the big idea segment of this episode. The big idea. So this is something I don't think anyone really talks about enough with Alastair Reynolds' writing, which is how genuinely philosophical his books are. In Revelation Space, there are all sorts of really well-integrated philosophical extrapolations that are executed at the level of really impressive precision and philosophical reasoning. But there's this whole aspect of the story that deals with AI, and it really does seem like Reynolds is, I don't know if you could call him a techno-optimist because of how dark his stories are, but he does seem to think, you can tell, that things like AI won't utterly obliterate us in the coming years, but that down the line at least, AI will aid human beings. It'll help humans kind of do what they are trying to do. There are these alpha and beta level simulations. So beta level is this AI that you can train to like mimic your personality. It has your knowledge and abilities. If you're a scientist, you can have the simulation review documents for you. You can speak to it. In fact, Dan Sylvester actually turns on his dead father's beta simulation whenever he gets in trouble and needs guidance, right? So that he can essentially speak to his father's personality. And apparently it's possible to let the beta simulation inhabit your body if they can do something that you can't and you want to accomplish something. Like if your father's a surgeon and someone needs a surgery that your father is the only person who has the expertise to do it, well, you can sort of upload his beta simulation into your mind so that you can actually be the one to perform the surgery. So that is pretty wild, and it happens in this book. And if all of this sounds totally out there, just remember, people are actually doing this as we speak. I just read a story about an influencer, this woman who spoke into this computer and answered all these prompts and is basically training an artificial intelligence to act and think like her and basically adopt her the idiosyncrasies of her personality. So there's that, right? And she's charging people to basically allow them to have her AI as their girlfriend, right? So it's kind of, that kind of thing is kind of creepy. There are people who clone themselves in this book and then try to get that simulation sort of uploaded into their clone's brain. I won't say anything more about that because it's kind of central to the plot. So we definitely get a lot of questions in this book that deal with metaphysics, memory, philosophy of mind, that grapples with this question of what is it that makes us who we are? What is consciousness? When Sylvester is talking to the beta simulation of his father and the hologram of his father is speaking and acting in the exact same way that his father would have, with the same jokes and the stories and the memories and the witticisms, is that his father? Are our personalities things that we can bottle like that we can package, right? Or do we have to be embodied in order to be ourselves? So we don't have too much time to get into the philosophical weeds here, but Reynolds definitely does raise a lot of these difficult philosophical questions, like what is the difference between a conscious being and an alpha or a beta simulation? If you ask the philosopher Thomas Nagel, I think he might actually still be alive, but I'm not sure. His famous essay is "What is it like to be a bat?" And his answer to that question is that a thing is conscious if there is something it is like to be that thing. So take the computer in front of you. It's thinking, it's computing, it's sensing, but that's not enough. Your computer senses the world. It has a camera. It takes in sense data that it can respond to. It can detect your speech and listen to you and respond to your commands. And yet, strictly speaking, your computer in front of you is not actually conscious, at least not yet. Our computers lack what philosophers call qualia, that inner subjective sense, that subjective quality of experience. So is there something it is like to be this computer? Does it feel pain? Does it have emotions when it senses things? No. It might be able to beat you at chess with its narrow artificial intelligence, but what does this computer feel like after it beats you at chess? Nothing. It's just programmed to respond in certain ways. It's just following commands. So if you kick me in the shin, not only do I act like I'm in pain, I hop on one foot and scream, but I also feel the pain. There is something it is like to feel that pain. But if I punch my computer, I suppose you could program a computer to respond in that very way, to scream, so to speak, right? It could seem angry, but is it really angry? Does it feel when you punch the computer? No, it doesn't. At least not yet. It has no conscious apprehension of anything. It's programmed, and there's no locus of will or intention there. But in a sense, we're also programmed too, right? So where's the line? We're programmed genetically according to a code and environmentally. So is our consciousness just an illusion or a strange loop? Or something like that. So these are all interesting questions. So if you want the insider baseball philosophy explanation, this is called the hard problem of consciousness, which is the question of why do physical processes, cells, tissues, brain matter, physiochemical interactions, neurons, and C fibers firing, why do these physical things give rise to conscious experience at all? And if it's true that consciousness is an emergent property of the matter that makes us up, does this fact about us give us moral standing? Does it confer a special moral worth upon us? And you might think I'm just, overblowing the philosophical aspects of this book, but I'm not. There's real exploration of these topics of a philosophy, for example, called property dualism, which is the idea that consciousness supervenes on matter and that conscious states are emergent properties of brain states, and that if you can understand one, you can understand the other. And I'll read a passage here for you about this. This is just one small passage where Reynolds is really exploring some interesting philosophy here. So I'll read this for you. This is in chapter 22. Reynolds writes, "He was already learning things about her implants, unraveling their structures, reading out their data. Once he had those, he would adjust the trawl to resolve cortical patterns, pulling webs of neuronal connectivity from her skull. Khoury knew a lot about trawling just by knowing people in intelligence. Embedded in those topologies lay long-term memories and personality traits tangled together in ways that were not easy to separate. But if Sajaki's equipment was not the best, chances were good that he had excellent algorithms to distill memory traces. Over centuries, statistical models had studied patterns of memory storage in 10 billion human minds, correlating structure against experience. Certain impressions tended to be reflected in similar neural structures, internal qualia, which were the functional blocks out of which more complex memories were assembled. Those qualia were never the same from mind to mind, except in very rare cases, but neither were they encoded in radically different ways, since nature would never deviate far from the minimum energy route to a particular solution. The statistical models could identify those qualia patterns very efficiently, and then map the connections between them out of which memories were forged. All Sajaki had to do was identify enough qualia structures, map enough hierarchical linkages between them, and then let his algorithms chew through them. And there would be nothing about her that he could not in principle know. He could sift through her memories at leisure, right? So very interesting, this way of sort of being able to understand mental states by examining brain states through this research. There's even some exploration of object metaphysics and questions of personal identity over time. Some of these Derek Parfit teletransporter scenarios that he explores in his book, Reasons and Persons. All that good stuff that I learned when I was a philosophy major and that I teach in my philosophy class now as an adult. So anyways, Alastair Reynolds is one of those few authors who can make hard sci-fi novels set hundreds and thousands of years in the future seem believable, plausible, and utterly compelling. There are even some classic sci-fi tropes in here, right? The one of the main ones in here is the classic uplift trope, right? Which is very important to this story. You might even say that the Fermi paradox lies at the heart of this story. And Reynolds really gives us a fascinating sort of fictional answer to that, right? And I'll just lastly say this. At the end of this book, if you're not just itching to find out more about the inhibitors and their past, I don't know what you're all about, right? This book just has layers and layers and layers of stories, and you could talk about each storyline interminably. And really, at the end of this book, you feel like you are just left wanting more, which is an excellent quality. All right, let's get into just a few of the minute, nitpicky things that I didn't like. Overall, this book, I would say this is the main criticism of Alastair Reynolds. What he does is he keeps a distance from his characters. He never really gets... Sometimes he gets inside of the characters' heads, but there's less of that internal focalization, as literary critics put it. There's less of that sense that you're really inside of the characters' heads, getting to know them, getting to know their thoughts and their agency and their concerns and their hopes and their dreams and their memories. You're really kind of above the characters. Alastair Reynolds has this very Kubrickian, Stanley Kubrick, that is, sensibility, where he seems to view his characters as chess pieces, and he's really the master up above at 30,000 feet, controlling his characters like a puppet master. So it doesn't feel like you're ever really in the characters' heads enough. And it's true, there is a lot of exposition and descriptions of technology and how that technology works. And I would say this is a flaw, except that Reynolds, again, other people have put it this way. I think Moyd at Media Death Cult put it this way, is that Reynolds is kind of the master of the info dump, because Reynolds is one of the few writers where his info dumps are entertaining and you're kind of like in a state of joy to even be reading them, which is kind of interesting. Like, info dumps aren't usually good, and so much of this book is delivered via someone telling the other characters the history of the Dawn War or something like that. And it goes on for pages and pages, and yet it's all really fascinating. And so I think some of that in big space opera novels is kind of unavoidable. There is a part that drags in the middle for about 150 pages, so there is a slog in the middle of this book. And I would say that is usually not a big problem if the characters are really well fleshed out. These characters are not... there aren't really any likable characters in this book. You're very interested in what they're doing and what they're trying to learn and what they're trying to accomplish, but none of the characters in here are deeply likable. A lot of the ultras are very sort of, as I said, Machiavellian and almost sociopathic. You're never quite sure why anyone is doing anything. What animates these ultras? What animates people? Why do they do what they do? Why do they value what they value? Why? And you never really are given answers to that. I'll just give one last criticism here, and it's really not unique to Alastair Reynolds. Space opera novels like this can feel sometimes sterile, rootless, cold, in a way that you really don't get as much with fantasy novels. The characters in space opera novels, if they're not single, they're usually enmeshed in these very transactional relationships. They're always something punk. They're very atomized individuals. They're either corrupt plutocrat elites, or they're oppressed belters or miners, or they're ultras, right? They're augmented and modified. They're always on some long journey to solve some puzzle or problem, always freezing themselves and losing all of their relationships so that they can be alive 50 years later when the next task has to be completed. But there's never enough of the why that we should be asking. The characters in novels like these are what the British journalist David Goodhart calls anywhere people. They have mobile souls. They're anywhere people, which is precisely the opposite of what most people are. Most people are somewhere people, to use Goodhart's paradigm. Somewhere people are people who value tradition, stability, home, family, memory, generational continuity, the soil, place, right? I'll quote the French demographer Christophe Guilly. He says that essentially somewhere people are people for whom relocation is almost always a wrenching experience. In these very cold, sterile space opera novels, you meet characters who are rootless, who don't have a place that they call home. Even the ship isn't their home. They'll destroy their ship and buy another one, right? And so, yeah, there's a very sort of cold feeling that you get from some of these space opera novels. And as much as I love to read them, again, this is one of the things I love about Reynolds is that he creates this aesthetic that you're sometimes craving. Sometimes you're craving that, right? Sometimes you don't want to be in the Shire. You want to be out on an adventure with these ultras. But I do think sometimes you need a palate cleanser after something like this. All right, so we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Goodreads, Patreon. Tip your starving booktuber. Buy me a coffee. Without further ado, happy reading.